Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. And thank you all for coming. Many thanks to Professor Sissel McCarthy for hosting and moderating tonight's event. My name is Kim Sawyer, and I am the director of the Pulitzer Center Reporting Fellows Program. The Pulitzer Center is a journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C. We support reporting in 5 focus areas: climate and the environment, global health, peace and conflict, human rights, and artificial intelligence. And I would like to recognize board member Dick Moore and his wife, Barbara, who are here tonight. I was also going to recognize my husband, John Sawyer, who must be stuck in traffic. He is the founder and CEO of the Pulitzer Center, and he'll also be here. You can meet him at the reception. The Pulitzer Center gives grants to professional journalists from around the world and also supports students and recent graduates of our 40 campus partners: journalism schools, liberal arts colleges, HBCUs, schools of public health, and community colleges. I'm proud to say Hunter College has been our partner since 2017. For each of the last 7 years, we've awarded a fellowship to a Hunter student to support a journalism project. Pulitzer Center fellows from Hunter have reported on child refugees in Sweden, deforestation in Sierra Leone, mental health in Japan, landmine clearance in Vietnam, overfishing in Greece, and the biogas industry in Ireland. Tonight, I would like to congratulate our recently named 2024 Hunter College Reporting Fellow, Andrew Balaban. Andrew will report from Portland, Oregon on innovative approaches to stormwater management through maintaining green spaces, such as roof gardens and forests, and blue spaces, creeks and ponds. We very much look forward to working with you, and if you would like to know more about Andrew's topic, please look for him at the reception. The Pulitzer Center selects students who are curious, resourceful, and skilled reporters. We help train them to produce amazing stories. Stories that inspire action, stories that represent diverse voices, including those of younger generations around the world. Stories that build community, stories that help find solutions for the greatest challenges that face our world. This is the backbone of the Pulitzer Center mission. This is also the heart of Stephanie Haynes' reporting. Stephanie was one of Pulitzer Center's very first grantees, reporting from Southern Africa. She went on to receive multiple grants from the Pulitzer Center. We're about to hear both from Stephanie and Professor McCarthy. But before I turn this over to them, I want to say a word about Eleanor Roosevelt. After all, we're now in what was once home to the Roosevelts. And I am both a great admirer and the author of an Eleanor Roosevelt biography for young readers. Eleanor's forceful personality is legendary. She was a warm and courageous person who cared deeply for young people. She would have been pleased to know we are discussing Stephanie's project, The Climate Generation, Born into Crisis, Building Solutions. During the Great Depression, Eleanor and President Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps to provide jobs for young men to work in national forests and parks. Their National Youth Administration put almost 5 million men and women from ages 16 to 25 to work. In 1948, Eleanor championed human rights for all people, young and old, taking the lead on the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These include the right to housing, food, and medical care. An ambitious goal for the Earth's 8 billion people fighting climate change. But, as Eleanor once said, surely, in the light of history, it is more intelligent to hope rather than to fear, to try rather than to not try. For one thing we know beyond all doubt, nothing has ever been achieved by the person who says it can't be done. Tonight, as you hear from Stephanie Haynes, you will find that the younger generation offers hope for the future here in the United States, throughout the world, and among vulnerable communities where people are most affected by climate change. Thank you, Stephanie, for telling these stories.
Thank you, Kim, and good evening, everyone. Before we get to our special guest tonight, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Pulitzer Center for its incredible support of Hunter College. Hunter has been a member of the Pulitzer Center's campus consortium, as Kim mentioned, and I still remember my first call with Kim back in September 2016, which led to our first Pulitzer Fellow, and the rest is history. Here we are, 8 fellows later. Thanks to the Pulitzer Center's generosity, we've had many wonderful award-winning journalists like Stephanie Haynes come to campus to speak to students in classes, in small groups, over lunch, and it's just an incredible opportunity for students to meet professional journalists who inspire them. Most of you may not know this, but it's a special year because Kim, who is the head of the campus consortium, and her husband John, who I'm sure is on his way, the CEO of the Pulitzer Center, are retiring after 18 years of building this wonderful organization. They started just with some seed money and a passion for journalism. And now the Pulitzer Center is the largest single source of money for global enterprise reporting. And I'll say that again, the largest source of money for global enterprise reporting. In fact, more than 3,000 journalists have benefited from their grants and fellowships. Kim and John, congratulations. Your work could not be more important, and your legacy is the thousands of stories that would not be told without your support, as well as the team that you have built up and that will continue this important work. So I want to say it's been such a joy working with you over all these years, and I hope everyone will join me in a round of applause for Kim and John. This event also could not be possible without this wonderful venue, the Roosevelt House, and I'd like to thank Mac Barrett, Bree DeAngelis, Danny Culkin, and Michaela Duca, who are helping us with all the preparations and planning tonight. I'd also like to thank Kelly Anderson, the chair of our Film and Media Studies Department, and David Pavlowski, and also Nicola Schmidt from the Pulitzer Center, who wasn't able to be here. She's done a lot for tonight. And just so everyone knows the program, our talk and Q&A is going to last about an hour, and then we will head upstairs for a reception where we can continue the conversation. I do want to remind students who would like extra credit for attending tonight that you do need to sign in before leaving, and Professor Alm, who is here, has a little sign-up sheet, so he and I will be taking down your name, so make sure you see us before you leave. But I hope everyone will stay for a beautiful reception upstairs in FDR's drawing room. Now, finally to our main event and our special guest, award-winning journalist Stephanie Haynes. I'm thrilled that so many journalism students have been able to meet her and interact with her today, and you're in for a real treat tonight. Climate change is a top priority for so many people, young and old. In fact, 2/3 of Americans say they are now worried about global warming, according to Yale University. Even more say global warming will harm future generations. Unfortunately, there is strong support for research into renewable energy, with 8 in 10 people backing clean energy sources and other climate change initiatives. And that's where our guest speaker, Stephanie Haynes, comes in. Stephanie has chronicled what young people like you are doing around the world about climate change right now. Here's something that she wrote in this series. From the gleaming financial capital of Frankfurt to the sea breeze coasts of our Barbados, from the big skies of Montana to the waterlogged streets of Bangladesh, from the sunny countryside of Portugal to the wind-blown ice of the Arctic, a breathtaking transformation is underway, with young people seizing on a crisis moment to tackle the inequalities and injustices that have long saddled their nations, crafting a new ethos about consumption, about progress, and what it means to have a good life. Just a bit of background on Stephanie. She is currently the Christian Science Monitor's Environment and Climate Change reporter. Before working for the Monitor, she was covering justice for both the Concord Monitor and the Baltimore Sun. She was also a correspondent in Southern Africa in the mid-2000s, where she wrote and reported on the many intersections of development, conflict, conservation, and culture. Her work with the Pulitzer Center in Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique led to her critically acclaimed book, White Man's Game: Saving Animals, Rebuilding Eden, and Other Myths of Conservation in Africa. Stephanie has been an Alicia Patterson Fellow and a grant recipient from the Pulitzer Center multiple times. She teaches at Yale University's School of Environment and the College of William and Mary. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Haynes.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. This has been an amazing day. The students at Hunter are just incredible. We've had great conversations. I also want to add my thanks to Kem and to John whenever he arrives. Oh, he's back there. Hi. They have been incredible mentors and supporters of journalists and journalism. And you heard that some of my work in the mid-2000s in Southern Africa were one of their early projects. I think they've done more than just allow for great stories. They built hope into this profession at a time when it didn't have much. And I think that the seeds that ended up growing into, or the way that evolved, has just been incredible. And I'm so proud of seeing how the Pulitzer Center has grown and what it's done. So thank you so much. I want to just give another round of applause there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the series that we just did with the Pulitzer Center and some of the background on it, and then hopefully we can have a conversation and questions and answers and talk more informally. But it starts with the late 1980s when my publication, the Christian Science Monitor, ran a critically acclaimed series about the hardships facing children around the world. 2 print reporters and a photojournalist traveled to different countries and talked to young people who are working in mines and in factories, as soldiers, and as child prostitutes. They documented child marriage and child slavery. They called their work Children in Darkness. These pieces ran in 1987, and that was 2 years before the United Nations committed to the Conventions on the Rights of a Child. Now, this move was a breathtaking international recognition, not just that this thing called childhood existed, but that young people had themselves inalienable rights. Things like a right to a home, to be free of violence, the right to stay with their parents, the right to a future. So fast forward a few decades, and a colleague and I started talking about whether there was a way to update this series, whether there was another way to do a global sweeping look at children and the state of children in the world. But to do it with a different lens. Eventually, this conversation evolved into the project supported by the Pulitzer Center that we'll talk about today, this year-long effort on multiple continents, all focused on what we are calling the climate generation. But to explain how we got there, I want to tell you a little bit about the Monitor itself, because that has a lot to do with the stories that we ended up telling. The Christian Science Monitor has a small newsroom, but we have correspondents all over the world. Despite the name, it's not a religious publication. Its founder created it in 1908 to spread light on the world. We've won Pulitzer Prizes and other recognitions. And you can see here how it's in the middle, lands regularly in the middle of the media bias chart. But we in the newsroom, we say that we do actually have a bias. And we say that we have a bias for hope. And that's because hope is implicit. It's the implicit foundation of any solution. You can't solve problems if there's not some seed that they can be solved. And so we're conscious of that when we try to find stories. We're looking for hope. We're looking for connecting values. We're looking for inspiration. And while we think it's important to reveal problems like we did in that Children in Darkness series, it's equally important to look for the inspiration that connects people and that helps them imagine better futures. And this makes for really good reporting because it forces us to look for nuance and it makes us dig deeper. And it's not just good for storytelling, but we believe that it's important for our industry. As you all well know, because you're in this world, this is a hard time in the media landscape in a lot of ways. It's spectacularly saturated, it's often partisan, and it's increasingly under attack. But stories that clear-sightedly look at challenges, but also, and as well, look at agency and connection and at deep shared values, these stories bring in readers. These are stories that counter news fatigue and disillusionment. And at a human level, they counter despair and doomerism. And perhaps that's nowhere more important than my beat, which is climate change. And so let's go back to that conversations that I had with my colleagues about updating the Children in Darkness series. This is the photographer that shot that series. She's still a colleague of mine today. Her name is Melanie Stetson-Freeman. She's great. And she also works regularly with my colleague here, Sariana. She's our Americas editor, and she's based in Toronto, although there she's in the Arctic. We started talking about how do you update this? That's a really big topic. How do you do a story about the state of the world's children? We weren't necessarily going to write about climate change. That wasn't the intention. We really wanted to find the topic that most mattered. We started brainstorming, calling sources. We brought in some other people. This is Alfredo Sosa, our photo editor, and Clara Germani, the special projects editor at The Monitor. And we started talking together. And again, with this initial reporting, we noticed really early on this paradox. Since that Children in Darkness series, the situation for children around the world had improved. The UN did codify the rights of the child, all countries except for the US, but that's something else. But the state for children worldwide had improved dramatically. There were still wrongs, there were still hardships, there were still human rights violations, but violence had gone down. Health metrics had gone up. The generation born since 1989 had grown up with unprecedented rights. And indeed, this generation assumed that they had rights. That was new. And things were looking good. But something else was happening as well during that same time. At the same time as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere passed what scientists believe is the maximum level for a stable environment. In other words, these young people who had been born into an age when children's rights and so much progress was happening were also born into an age of unprecedented environmental challenge. Even, as this graph shows, even if humans stop sending carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air today, the atmosphere will warm. Young people will live in a world that is climatically different than that older people lived in. We wanted to know what this paradox meant. We also knew something else. Climate change wasn't fair. There are some countries in some parts of the world that are putting more carbon dioxide into the air and have historically, individual carbon footprints are different. We also knew that children know this and that there's a deep sense of climate anxiety and unease across different demographic and geographical lines. We also knew that climate change is an exacerbator, so all of these rights that children have gained to housing, to food security. All of that was threatened. But we didn't want to stop there, because that's kind of a depressing story. And more than we didn't want to write a depressing story, we knew that it wasn't true. Something had to have happened with all of those rights, with all of that agency. There had to be more there. And we really wanted to find out what it was. This generation, with so much connectivity, so much agency, so much progressy, had to be doing something about this. And so with funding from the Pulitzer Center, we went around the world to try to figure out what it was. We realized that climate change is transformative. And because of it, young people are reshaping ideas from everything about how we live to what we eat, what we are creating, what progress is, and what it is to live a good life. This is the series that we ended up creating, and I want to start with a short video that we did to go along with it.
Climate change can be scary, especially for young people who wonder about their future in a heating world. But over the past year, we've traveled around the globe talking to young people about what they are doing in the face of climate change. And we found a ton of hope and progress in the climate generation. We've met innovators, conservationists, activists, regenerators, challengers, adapters. There are big challenges ahead, but there are also big hopeful transformations underway. Our series about the climate generation's revolution will look at all of this. Read it in the Christian Science Monitor.
So that was our little, the little video that went with it, but then we had to just do this. Like, where do you go? You have a project, you can go anywhere in the world, you want to tell a really big story. How do you figure it out? We had a lot of conversations about this. Climate is an everywhere issue. We could have gone anywhere, but we wanted to be intentional about how we told this story. So we picked places that mattered for a particular reason, with characters that would be able to show some of the import with a transformation that was also happening. One place we knew we needed to go to was the Arctic. The Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. And while that is a problem for the globe's environmental systems, for the rising of the ocean, for different currents, it's also a really big problem for the people who live there, who make their livelihoods and whose culture is based on the cold. And so we found that there was a group of people in Canada who were trying to put together a program to have Indigenous elders teach their younger generation and younger community members how to interact with the land in a new way. And it was bringing back Indigenous belief systems to help younger people get both livelihoods, food, and help with scientific projects on the ice. This remote town, Telojawak, which my colleague Sarah, who was actually the one to travel here, made me pronounce like 4 times before she would let me come and talk about this by myself, is reachable only by plane. And Sarah and Mel flew there to the Arctic Circle to connect with one of these Canadian Guardian groups. And what they saw was first this real show of how, even though there are houses here, that's not what people consider home. Home is out there on the ice. This is one of the young guardians, a guy named Hunter, and he talked about because of how this program was tapping into a new and old way of interacting with the earth. And this is something that we saw in every place we went. You could have gone and reported this as a project story. Here's one initiative that's happening, it's interesting, we're gonna write about it, and we're gonna, tell that story. But what we realized was that this idea of breaking down silos between what is nature and what is human and how to interact with the surrounding ecosystem in a way that's holistic, these elements of Indigenous practices are being absorbed in a much new and enthusiastic way by younger people. We heard this from Barbados to Portugal to Montana. It was something that we saw a lot. Here, Guardians are ice fishing. They use hockey sticks. They also went out onto the Arctic Circle to look at where ice thickness had changed. And they were working to do these programs where they were combining technology with indigenous elder knowledge to try to remap their area in the face of a warming climate. My colleague said that this was one of the scariest reporting trips that she ever went on because it looks like you're about to fall through the Arctic Ocean. There's actually ice under there, but they were a little bit nervous about it. So it was a great story by itself, but it meant something more. And that was the same thing that we did for all of our places, including Barbados. We knew that we wanted to go to a small island developing state. As is the case with many places in the world, those places most affected by climate change are not the places that have been the most responsible for causing it. You saw that earlier graph looking at what individuals based on country carbon footprints are, and you can see the disparity in there. Climate becomes very quickly a justice issue within countries and internationally. So we knew we wanted to go to a small island state. We ended up picking Barbados because Barbados's Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, is deeply involved with an effort to try to revamp the world's financial system. Right now, developing countries are often in a catch-22 when it comes to climate finance. They are suffering the natural disaster impacts of climate change. They're also stuck in a debt system because they have to rebuild after those climate disasters. And the world's financial system is not built for this. So countries stay in debt, they can't invest in climate infrastructure and resilience, and they're really stuck. And so there's an effort that's being led by a number of leaders in the Global South to try to reform this. And so Mia Mottley in Barbados was one of them. So I wasn't exactly sure what story, though, we were going to get from the climate generation. We just knew that this was interesting and people were thinking about finances and entrepreneurial efforts. And we ended up focusing on innovation. What I found when I went to this island were all of these people who were involved on a for-profit and sometimes academic research angle of turning climate change into business. This guy here, Joshua Forte, had decided to harvest sargassum seaweed, which was landing on Barbados in unprecedented levels, in part because of climate change, and use that to build a type of compost that would help the island develop a homegrown agricultural system. One of the big problems on islands across the world is food insecurity. There's not great, for a lot of different complicated reasons, most islands tend to import food that has climate implications itself. So they were collecting sargassum, turning it into compost, selling it, and building a local food system. Sargassum was also at the root of another project that I visited at the university there. And there, a group of students with a professor were trying to learn how to turn sargassum seaweed and rum distillery wastewater into a new type of biofuel that could decarbonize the island's transportation system. This was really interesting, and I've been thinking about it in the context that we're having right now, where there's a lot of debate about EVs, electric vehicles. Some of the questions raised about them here were raised there first, where they're expensive. And while there was an effort to decarbonize the transportation sector, basically get rid of fossil fuel gas vehicles, a student raised her hand in this professor's class and said, well, that's really nice, but I'm not going to buy one of those. And she thought about it, and she was like, yeah, I can't afford one either. And then they developed this new type of biofuel that will solve the problem. This to us was a recognition that a lot of the climate solutions are coming from young people and coming from young people in the Global South. That's also why we went to Namibia. We knew, again, we wanted to make sure that we wrote a story from the continent of Africa. We ended up going to Namibia because Namibia is billing itself right now as the hub of clean energy in southern Africa. As you see, it's got a lot of sun. It's also working to develop green hydrogen projects. It's also the site of a lot of new oil discoveries. So there's a tension there that brings up lots of questions, not only about the future of the world's energy systems, but also equity issues. Is it fair for the developed world to tell Namibia that it can't develop its own oil and gas resources and have that sort of energy independence? It's also an area and a place where lots of people don't have electricity and access to energy. But there was something else that was happening in Namibia. And again, this is the great thing about journalism. You go and then you find things that maybe you weren't expecting. The young activist community in Namibia is incredible. And when we first started doing this story, we got a little bit of pushback within our newsroom. And they're saying, okay, young climate activists, like we kind of think about Greta Thunberg, we kind of think about global north, white, complaining young people. Like, is that really what we're going to read a story about? And we were like, no, it's definitely not that. And what we found as we traveled, that the leaders of the climate political movement right now internationally are from the global south. And it makes, this is Dion Suzuka's house right here. And it makes sense because, again, climate has not been just. The people who are suffering the most from climate change are people who have contributed the least. And increasingly, young people who are now, again, connected in ways that is unprecedented. Young people are letting people within those most vulnerable, most affected communities take a larger stage in trying to build solutions. Here is another young activist that called on Dion, who speaks at different global conventions, speaks for the UN, who lives in a small one-room house with his mother and doesn't have a bed himself. The other activist asked him to come. These kids all came on a Saturday morning themselves because they wanted to hear about green hydrogen and climate activism. And so again, there's this real tension. There needs to be energy independence in a place like Namibia, but how do you do it well? This is Dion in his house. He was reluctant at first to let us go in because he hadn't shown his own living quarters. He has one suit. It's hung right there. His mother lives on the other side of that wall. He doesn't get paid for what he does, but he sleeps surrounded by books about climate and climate policy. This is his mom right here, and this is him at a convention. We realize that this generation is connected, and it is trying to reverse long-standing power structures by giving people like Dion more of a lead role, but obviously there are still huge barriers and huge inequities that we saw. And you saw that a lot in the US. We knew, again, we needed to write about the United States because we are the largest emitter historically of greenhouse gases. Also this summer, we had the first successful youth climate lawsuit take place in the US. This is Grace Gibson Snyder. She was one of the plaintiffs in the case of young people in Montana suing the state because previously the state had not considered climate impacts while making energy policy. And this group of young people, aided by a nonprofit law firm called Our Children's Trust, took the state to court. It had been going on for a long time. We weren't really sure what was going to happen. It went to trial. It was the first to go to trial. And then the judge actually ruled in the youth plaintiffs' favors, which I have to say, even as a climate change writer, I was kind of surprised. I think I had gotten into that pattern of no, nothing is ever going to change. But they did. They ruled in their favor, and that had ramifications globally. Not just the minutia of that Montana case gets sort of in the legal weeds, but there was this point that young people could demand government act in a particular way, and it would. And that in and of itself was inspiring to this very connected group of people. Bangladesh we had to go to because it's one of the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change. We heard from a lot of people that if anybody is a climate skeptic, this is my colleague Sarah talking to people in Dhaka. If you are a climate skeptic, you should just spend some time in Bangladesh because nobody there is a climate skeptic. There's huge amounts of flooding. It was already a low-lying, flood-prone place. It's even more so. Lots of climate migrants. This family here has been moving their house back repeatedly. And people are going from areas from like that past slide to here, Dhaka, the capital, and you see the low-lying landscape and the situation there. We hear a lot about climate migrants in the, well, I don't know if everybody does, but that's a conversation that people who are focused on climate hear a lot about. It's super complicated. Again, climate is an exacerbator. It's sometimes not the only cause for things, but the idea that people are going to have to move because some places become uninhabitable because of climate, that's real. And you see it here in Bangladesh. It presents youth human rights issues. We go back to that rights of a child. But there are also a lot of programs in Bangladesh. Again, these developing countries that for years have been sort of listening to and having to follow global north policies because they're facing some of these climate realities first. They're coming up with solutions first as well. So in this, this is a UNICEF program teaching young children about the environment. And you also have other cities like this, like Mangla, that's wanting to recreate itself to be a climate migrant friendly city. And so it's doing things through education. It's bringing these young people, they're all studying climate change and embracing new arrivals intentionally who are moving for climate reasons. There's a salination problem with the water, and so they have set up these rainwater collection sites. So there are lots of little things that happen in these areas that, again, are showing a mindset shift amongst young people to live in this new world. These young women are really acutely aware as well of the intersections between climate change and other political issues, even including child marriage, which was something that they all brought out. This was a fun picture because this was while my colleague was asking questions to somebody else about climate change. These girls all ran and got their climate change textbooks, and we're all trying to figure out the answer to the question. So this is just more here of Bangladesh. The stories that probably resonated the most with readers, though, was from Portugal. And this is a story that I did because I wanted to write about food systems, but we ended up finding a lot more. And this ended up sort of being the crux of this problem and looking at this mindset shift. I was interested in young people who were returning to the rural parts of Portugal to go and farm again and do so in a climate-friendly way. And while I certainly found that, I found more people who were questioning the idea of what it was to have a good life. People who had spent years working in the cities, who had been focused on consumption, who had maybe looked at a different type of path, were coming back to areas that young people in Europe have left and thinking that a lower growth, more sustainable way of life was more appealing. And it wasn't just farmers. They knew that not everybody is going to be able to go have an Instagram-worthy small farm where they feed their family with lovely tomatoes, right? Like, those places are great, and the tomatoes were wonderful, but they were also partnering with other people living in smaller rural areas to build cooperatives that were actually degrowth cooperatives. So you had architects and physicians and different professors working together in a way to try to support each other, recreate the idea of how it was to be successful. And that, to me, summarized this project. There were real mindset shifts that were happening across place and across ethnicity and across nationality. This was just a pig because it was fun to. So I'm going to wrap that up here because this was the story for me of this project. And it was a story of hope. It was a story of people who were coming up with new solutions, who are changing the way they were living, people who were understanding that this big challenge, so often portrayed in journalism as this doom and gloom, terrible situation, is challenging. It does have doom and gloom in it some places, but it's also a transition. And in this transition, there's an awful lot of hope. And in some way, that's a metaphor for what we're all doing here. All of you are interested in journalism. If you look at this project, you have organizations like the Pulitzer Center, you have Hunter, you have the Monitor. There's all of this transformation happening right now, and it can lead to these really hopeful projects and situations and ways of seeing the world. So thank you for listening to me talk for a long time about this story. I hope you guys will read it, and we'll get copies to distribute later, but thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna put that up too. Thank you. Turn that off, doesn't have to stay on the free trial. But if anybody wants the free trial, go for the.
All right, can everyone hear me? So congratulations on this project. Really amazing piece of work.
Oh, thank you so much.
And for our journalism students who are here, can you share some tips on how to approach and manage a project of this size?
Yeah, I mean, this was a big one. And there were many times that my colleague in this and I were just calling each other in despair because we were like, there's so much material. So if that happens, don't worry about it. But I think the first thing is to be a sponge. Like, we read so much before we even knew that we were writing about climate change. Mm-hmm. We talked to so many people. We just spread a really wide net and tried to absorb as much information as we could. We talked to each other, and then we sort of saw what was settling out. I think the best projects don't come from a preconceived notion, and that was sort of the pathway throughout.
Is there any special sauce, that secret ingredient for a story to really resonate with the public?
You know, I think sometimes we don't know, but there are some things that all stories that resonate really well have. And one of them is human element. We need to have really good characters. We need to find the things that connect that story to the human experience. We talked about this in some of the classes, but the Monitor in particular will look at what are those things that the story is really about. Like, is it a story about farming, or is it a story about how we live? Is it a story about a debate, or is it a story about compassion? And so finding those human elements that underlie good stories, I think that's always really important.
And you talked about storytelling, how important it is to tell stories about the challenges and connections and solutions. Have there been any real-world impacts that you know of from your stories, maybe not only this one, since this is relatively new, but other stories? Explain to students what the real-world impact is of journalism like this.
Sure. I mean, there are always great stories where somebody writes a piece and then a law changes, or there's an investigation, and those things are real and important. But sometimes I think the most important impact is that journalism like this can spark creativity. It can let people see the world in a more nuanced and creative way. And we don't know what solutions are going to come out of reading these stories, but we know that it opens people's minds to new ways of seeing and doing things.
Did you come up against anyone who didn't want you to tell this story? Any corporations or any people who really didn't want you to do a story about this?
Sure. I mean, whenever we write about climate change, you run into a certain segment that just disagrees with the premise. Like, how can you write about a climate crisis and a climate generation when there's no such thing as climate change? That's something that I deal with in my work a lot, but we luckily have a lot of really consistent science where I can figure out what's real and what's not based on that and go forward anyhow. You know, I think that sort of misinformation and disinformation is something that journalists for all beats have to deal with, and we can't let that stop us from telling stories.
And how should journalists, what is a journalist's role in tackling the misinformation and disinformation out there now? Not just about climate change, but other issues.
I mean, we're truth tellers, right? That's one of the things that we do. And while I think that we have to be incredibly aware, and even with climate, like if somebody says, oh, that's not true, like actually temperature gauges are wrong around the world, I'll check it out. I want to make sure that I really, really know. So I think doing good journalism is inherently the counter to misinformation.
Yeah. Antidote. I'd love to open it up to our students in the audience. What questions do you have for Stephanie?
Go ahead.
I was going to say yes. But that's okay. No, you don't have to say it. It's all good.
That's all right.
So, being in this field, how do you get past the constant block that is kind of a futile pursuit, because it's such a monstrous problem that is kind of out of our hands in a sense. Not to be defeatist.
With
but,
climate in particular?
Yeah, because it's it's a very not in our hands a lot of the time, just because we don't have control over what corporations do and things like that.
And first, I want to really acknowledge that, because I had some really important conversations with young people doing this story where they said, why is it always about the young people? Like, we're really tired of this. Like, we're tired of being told, you're the future, you're going to solve this problem. Isn't it great? You're so inspiring. It's like, where are the grown-ups? And so I want to acknowledge that, because I think it's really important to do so. I also think that while it's absolutely true that policymakers and corporations and people in power have huge roles to play in helping address this climate situation in a way that is most beneficial for everybody, I think change happens because of individual decision making. They're little pinpricks of light that form together to make change. And you see that in ways small and you see it in ways big, but it all starts from little individual actions. And so while sometimes it can feel overwhelming, everybody has to be part of that, because in some ways there's no other hope. Like, you have to keep fighting because it's our planet and it's our world, and we have to change the way that we live and change the way that we consume, and we have to come up with new beautiful solutions, and we have to imagine a beautiful future for this change that is happening. And so I think that everybody working on that is like the only possible way forward. So that would be, it's not a satisfactory, like, yes, you can like change ExxonMobil yourself, right? But I think that everybody, and we saw this with this mindset shift, like there are real generational changes happening right now. And that's because everybody individually is making changes themselves.
Yeah, one person can make a difference. Mr. Moore.
Well, the Monitor's audience, I mean, we would love our audience to be everybody, but we don't have that right now. So we're writing for a general audience, but we've been really working in this series to make sure that we try to reach young readers as well. So we had things we did with every piece that we published. We did a series of Instagram reels that went out and had fairly wide reach. We also did some podcasting around this story, and we tried to, through programs like this and others, tried to make connections to areas where there were going to be young people. We also tried to really network with the people who we were writing about and their circles, because there's, as I'm sure you well know, there's a tradition where in journalism, like we write, we leave, that's it. And in this, we really tried to continue the engagement. And we actually just got this great picture of our Bangladesh subjects all those three young girls holding copies of the Monitor and the project and grinning, and we're like, this is amazing. We have young people in Bangladesh talking about our series. This is so cool. So that's it's a broad answer, but that's what we were trying to do with this piece.
I'm not exactly sure how to frame the question, but I'm thinking the story in Portugal, it seems like there's this underlying theme of like degrowth and people trying to think about like a non-consumerist way of living. And I'm just like, I'm thinking back to COVID time and how it was like the world was going to fall apart because people were not buying stuff. And how do you kind of tell like these, I guess I'm wondering about the connection between these individual people's stories and like this massive system that we're living under where like the economy is just going to collapse if we don't keep buying things. And so how do you think about that? And like, have you done other stories that try to like address that really macro level in the, while connecting it to these individual stories?
Yeah, I mean, and degrowth itself is actually now, even I think in the time since I reported the story, really become more of a politicized and buzzword where people are throwing that around. I mean, it is something that is a debate and it has really interesting arguments on all sides. I'm actually going to be writing more about this, so I'll have a much more intelligent answer in like 2 months. But I think it's all of it. And I think what we're realizing is that we can't consume the way we consume now without any changes. So that change could be innovation, it could be technology, it could be a shift in lifestyle, it could be all of the things. And I think that young people in this generation are working on all of the things. And where that balance ends up falling, I don't know. I haven't done that work yet, so I don't have great thoughts on that. But I do think that all of those avenues are avenues that are going to be important.
And you feel like a shift is already underway?
Yes, for sure, for sure.
Walter?
This is just my opinion, but it seems to me that people I talk to, climate change has moved down the agenda. It's not as big a deal as it was 5, 6 years ago. And I think part of it is this anti-woke movement that's going on. So how would you change the narrative so that more people are more concerned and want to do something?
Well, I think the first answer to that is it's really hard to have a never-ending crisis. So if we are always talking about the climate crisis, it might be a crisis. In some ways, it's a transition. And when I'm thinking about reporting about it, I'm thinking about it as this macro global transition that we're all a part of. And so the stories are sometimes I'll try to avoid even saying climate change in my stories when I can, because that is sort of an amorphous thing that doesn't necessarily mean all that much, and it either makes somebody anxious or it makes them not interested. And I think the way to continue talking about it and keeping at it is to bring it down one level. So we're talking about energy systems, we're talking about food systems, we're talking about where is it going to be possible to build a house that's insurable. And those things are directly related to people, because somebody might not want to talk about climate change or might not care, but they will certainly care if an insurance company has decided that no longer can people get home insurance in a particular area, and that is an immediate crisis. And whether we label that climate change or not, maybe there's a debate as to whether it matters, whether it has the label. Because I hear you, it's hard to be arguing in crisis constantly.
One of the things I think we see in the U.S. is just kind of lower political from younger generations. Do you have any suggestions or where younger people participate, I guess, politically? Not so much at the national level, maybe lower levels like city councils or even in their own schools, they can help with the, what solutions or to give political cover,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so true about climate and climate action is that the most effective action is often where you are. And so people can work on their own blocks, in their own schools, in their own neighborhoods, in their own cities, and recognizing what, again, we start looking at climate as a transition. Like, what's happening in a particular block? Is it really hot because there are no trees and it's a heat island and we need to have some political action on making sure that things get more green? Is it hot in the building because it's a landlord-owned building and there's no way to update your windows? Like, there are very micro things that people can get involved in right now or tomorrow and have real impact that are connected to climate. And obviously, I think people will have different answers of where the best political action is, but pretty much anything you care about has a connection to climate. And so finding those places and working there would be my suggestion of where young people can turn in a way that feels impactful.
With the Rohingya community within Bangladesh? And if you were, did you find any specific intersection, or how did you tackle that intersection in your work?
So I did not go to Bangladesh myself. That was my colleague. And I don't believe she was writing about the Rohingya there. So I have an unsatisfactory answer of I do not know. So I could pontificate, but it would all be fake. So I'm sorry.
Sections and trying to think think outside the silo mindset, and maybe if you were, or if you, in this case, your colleague was in contact, how did you navigate that? But that's okay.
Well, I mean, I think if you're talking about displaced people, right, and people are potentially stateless people, you have these situations where, climate does because climate exacerbates all sorts of vulnerabilities in different ways, you will have intersections there. In this particular case, I don't know the specifics.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Sayeda.
Hi, I had a question again about Bangladesh since I'm from there, and but I'm also was raised here, so I was wondering, when you take on a project like this, when you have to reach out to different communities, maybe across the world, and from different identities as you, how do you check like the biases that you have and ensure that you're not being like I guess like talking down to people and that, and making sure that those that you're writing about or reporting on have a voice in the thing that you're working on, and also like the balance between or just like the idea that it's not always the fact that you so it's like there's like you like being a professional is one thing. Sorry, I'm having trouble wording the last part, but just the first part of what I said.
No, it's okay. I really appreciate the question, because there's a lot of conversation right now in journalism about extractive journalism, and it's especially in cases when people are going into communities that are different, whether it's domestically or internationally, taking stories. Do we understand people that we're interviewing? Do we understand the situations? How do we be respectful? How do we give real partnership to people who are in the communities whose stories are being told? Pulitzer Center, for instance, has done an amazing job with this, of really encouraging local partnerships between journalists from the US going to other places. In this case, it was in a different story. We worked closely with a local journalist and translator there who was important to the project, and Sarah would have been able to tell more about that relationship. One of the things that I do feel
is so important about journalism is the whole act of journalism is listening and caring about other people's stories without an intention to prove any point, but going there with the full intentionality of honoring those people's experiences and humanity. Like, that's the foundation of what we do. So there's certainly cultural mishaps that can be made, but I think that we do things such as working with local partners, doing sensitivity reads, and creating an institutional structure where we're making sure that we're not falling into different types of stereotypes, particularly when writing about less wealthy parts of the world. I do think that it's good that we still do it, because I think that this form of connection, of sharing stories and listening to stories around the world across difference, is a beautiful part of what we do. So I think that the photos and the reporting and the storytelling and the continued communication. I know my colleague continues to write back and forth with her sources in Bangladesh today. I think all of that goes into what hopefully is an exercise in mutual respect and honoring.
How hard is it to keep your personal views out of your stories, or do you bring a point of view? There is some journalism, that is more advocacy. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty old school with this. Like, I think that the more that you show you're an advocate, the less effective your journalism is, and the less effective. I mean, you can care about things. We're not robots. We can care, but I don't think that go into stories because I'm curious, and not because I have a point that I want to make.
Anyone else? Lots of nodding of the heads. Go ahead, Charlotte.
I also was wondering about when you go on these trips and follow up on these stories in these other places, like other countries and everything else. Is it difficult to get funding? Do you fund it yourself out of pocket, or do you have like a? Is it like a difficult process? Is it like a lot of convincing, or?
I mean, so the writ large question is these trips are expensive, especially international reporting. Oh my gosh, it's just shockingly expensive. And so organizations like the Pulitzer Center have just been incredibly important for continuing to allow American journalism and international journalism to make these international connections. We want to have, at least I want to have, a world where I know on a gut level the humanity of people in other places. And that's what we do. We try to show humanity and share light around the world. And it is so expensive. So, what we go through is we went through in this project a rigorous process internally over, is this really a story that's worth telling? Where do we want to tell it? And why do we want to tell it there? And then with the Pulitzer Center, we went through a number of conversations there as well, because they're responsible with their funding. They want to make sure that their dollars are going to do the best as well. So the funding is there to do these stories. The Monitor and the Pulitzer Center are two unique organizations because they care about the world so much. I would say it's rare, but it's available. And it does take a lot of work. Yeah.
Another question, Stephanie. You want your story to have an impact. You don't want to publish something and then have it sink.
Of course.
What did you do on this story to do and your editors? Give it leg.
Sort of to make sure that it was seen and. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean.
Events like this.
Events like this are definitely, but it's a great question. I think it's a question for everybody in journalism. How do we deal with a spectacular assault on our attention right now, right? How do you get somebody to read an 8-magazine cover story series when you could be scrolling through the latest Taylor Swift news, right? That sometimes is a hard fight. But I also feel like really solid pieces of journalism have legs. So what we're noticing from our analytics on the Monitor side is that these stories weren't just read once when they came out and now are gone. Like, we're constantly getting traffic to them. And we do have a social media team and a marketing team at our organization that tries to connect people to the story. We have gone down the social media route of trying to get people that way. I think that probably they would say that they're moderately effective and would like to be much more effective. But I think that until we crack that code, we have to just keep putting out the best journalism that we can, because it does have lasting power. And that's something that at least we're finding with this.
And that's something where you can do something. You can share good journalism with your network. If everyone did that, right, then it's exponential. So yes, read it and share it. Anyone else? Any more students in the back? Sure. You've got to say your name now, though.
Hi, Andrew.
If I can ask about something about your career in
Sure.
journalism. Okay, so when you were younger, like in college, and you were trying to pursue journalism, or I don't know if you decided that early on, but how did you get involved, and how did you stay motivated to keep pursuing? Because I feel like today it's a little harder because everything's digital. And, you know, it's more click-worthy and not actual, like, reporting, I guess, in a sense. But I don't know. Just how did you stay motivated and get involved to make this a career? I know that's, like, a lot.
No,
to
well, I mean, you kind of have
describe.
two questions, because I had a different situation, right? It wasn't all digital clickbait, sort of people trying to write, recap stories all the time. I worked for my college newspaper. I loved it. Actually, John was my first professional journalism boss, because I was an intern at the Washington Bureau of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch during one of my summers in college. I found people who were great editors. Whatever you do when you go into your first jobs, make sure you're going places where you can learn from other people, because that will also help keep you inspired, even if the majority of your job isn't something that you love. If you have the room and the mentorship to expand into those reporting areas that you do love, that will be fantastic. We were talking about this in another class today, but I wonder whether we're not going to have some sort of turn back to print. I mean, we know that the digital space is becoming a soup of misinformation, and with AI, it's going to become even more so. And it might be that holding on to a magazine that's a thing becomes increasingly appealing. So I think that there are those industry aspects of it, but then remember that you have a job where you get to follow your curiosity and talk to different people and to experience other people's lives and worlds. And just that honor of being able to meet and listen to and understand so much more of the world is a great motivator. So I don't say that. I say that with the full acknowledgement that sometimes your first jobs and trying to get that, especially in today's media landscape, can be really tough. So I don't want to be like, it's wonderful all the time. But I think you'll find those spaces. Look for the good people.
And it's worth it. One last question. What's your next project? What's your next story you're working on?
Oh, gosh. Well, I am going to be working on degrowth and some questions about how that connects, and there's some of the big ethical justice questions about that when you have parts of the world that need to grow or believe they need to grow.
So stay tuned, everyone. All right, well, we're going to continue this conversation upstairs, but students who are in the journalism program, Professor Alm is right up here, and I'll have a sheet as well. Please sign in, and we'll see you upstairs. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Stephanie Haynes.
Thank you.